Welcome back. My name is Sam Hassel, and in today's episode, we are going to be discussing 5 different application red flags to avoid. So first off, before we get into the main episode, I wanted to just remind everyone that we are going to have an upcoming admissions masterclass. So that is going to be this Wednesday, August 7th, 7 to 9 p.m. Eastern Time over Zoom. So we've mentioned this in the past couple of episodes. We're going to be walking through a case study of an applicant who was unsuccessful in her college applications, had excellent GPA, course rigor, SAT scores, and sort of per what we've discussed on this podcast, she did not have a very strong resume or admissions narrative, as we've referred to it, to sort of differentiate her from the many students who all have excellent metrics, so to speak. And so we're going to be doing a deep dive into her candidacy and basically revising her candidacy from 9th grade and building the sort of admission story that would actually differentiate her at many of the top colleges to which she did not actually gain admission. So that is, again, going to be this Wednesday, August 7th, 7 to 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and we will have a registration link in the show notes and show summary. Okay, so getting back to the main topic of today's episode. So we're going to be walking through particularly the common application, which was just released or just rolled over as of August 1st for rising seniors who are applying during the upcoming 2024-2025 application cycle. So the common application just rolled over. There are a lot of the same informational fields in the Common App as typically are the case. Usually what tends to change year to year in the Common Application is the various school supplements or the school-specific essays, college by college. Most of the Common App fields don't generally change themselves, and so a lot of these fields that we're going to be discussing that can sort of trigger various red flags, stay fairly constant year to year. It's important to note that many of these red flags can be quite subtle, and it's also important to note that students and parents and families really have a mindset of, I've heard people refer to, filling out the Common Application as, merely data entry, and I think it's very easy to fall into this mindset of, sort of what I refer to as a stimulus response mindset. Is just I see some instructions and I just answer, the instructions. And in the future, we'll discuss why this is very problematic for certain essay prompts, particularly very trappy essay prompts that colleges ask. And because students are so accustomed to simply, for lack of a better way of describing it, just doing what they're told in school, and, not really seeing, the bigger picture, that this is a very strategic, highly competitive process, they sort of can fall into just this sort of, as I refer to it, stimulus response. Just there's a stimulus, the instructions, and they just simply respond, and they don't think too much about it. So I want to sort of, upset that framework a little bit and really replace it more with a mindset that everything that you relay about yourself in your application is strategic, or at the very least, it behooves you, and it's better to be, sort of safe than sorry, as they say. It certainly behooves you to view everything as possibly having a strategic component to it. And if it doesn't, then, that's certainly great. You can't change your name, for example. So there's not a lot of strategy that goes into putting your actual name on the application. However, I think it's better to assume a strategic mindset as your default assumption versus just assuming that, there is no strategy involved with answering a particular, responding to a particular component of the application. So that's first off, just have a very sort of strategically inclined mindset as you go about navigating the application, even fields that you might think are not necessarily strategic, and will sort of illustrate why this mindset can be important. And then, as I often have said on this podcast and often say to families, just keep in mind anything that you say can and will be used against you in the court of admissions. That's the nice phrase that I like to use, is any of this information that an admissions officer is reading can land a certain way. It could paint a certain picture of the student, their context, their likability, their uniqueness, their reading interest in the application process and compared to other students. So just very important to have this very strategic mindset. So first off, I'm going to go through the first mistake here. So this would seem potentially subtle, but listing the parents' occupations in the common application. So there'll be a parent 1, a parent 2 section, and students are required. So there are certain fields in the application that are required. They will have a red asterisk next to them, and you do have to answer those fields. The parent occupation field, however, is not actually a required field. It's an optional field. And so what, some students might do, particularly if they come from more advantaged or privileged socioeconomic backgrounds, is they will just volunteer that, their dad is a business executive, or some other, more socially elevated title. I think a lot of students almost have a certain amount of pride, I think, in their parents' backgrounds, their occupations, if they're elevated, roles, their educations, etc. And certainly a parent's education can be a strategic benefit to a student if the student has legacy status, for example. However, when it comes to the parent occupation, you have to keep in mind admissions officers are very well aware of students' context. They read the school profiles. They know if they come from, a private school or more privileged background. There's a lot of conversation about diversity. Admissions officers are particularly aware of diversity now that there isn't sort of this checkbox notion of race and ethnicity. They're trying to get at it more through college essays and, other sort of maybe less direct vehicles in the application. So it is, quite important just to be aware of some of these optics, some of these social optics, and the ways that admissions officers are going to interpret your context, basically. So it's fairly obvious that if a student puts something, for example, such as their parent is a business executive versus their parent is a writer or is a laborer is one of the options, they will land very differently. One could create a slightly higher rooting interest for the application if the parent came from much more of a blue-collar sort of a field, one that's not associated with as great of privilege or status, versus much more of a traditional sort of white-collar role. And, these little tiny sort of what I refer to as, social perceptual signals, they can matter, and they'll matter in potentially other ways that I'll mention shortly. Second, a student beyond sort of the designated categories of the parent's occupation, there's an other category where they can get really specific about the parent's occupation. And this could be particularly problematic if, for example, the parent's occupation is related to the student's interests. So it could be the case that the student is interested in biomedical areas and their parents, one of them or both of them, are doctors. And that can paint the student as having a bit of a, not even privilege from sort of a socioeconomic or sort of, societal perspective, but even more so from a environmental, that actually what their interests are, versus a student who maybe is interested in medicine but does not have the benefit of having two parents who are MDs. So some of this can be, just omitted from the application, and some of it can't be omitted from the application. So if parents have medical degrees, the degrees and the education are required fields in the application, so it really will depend in terms of what the parent's background is. But generally speaking, if a student comes from more privileged background, the parents assume, more elevated, traditionally successful roles, it's not going to help the student's case for admission to include this, and it's not required information. So just keep that in mind. Is a field required or is it optional? And if it's optional, is the inclusion of this information going to help you? Is it going to potentially hurt you or create a slightly, maybe not rooting interest for or lack of rooting interest for your application? Or is it just going to maybe be neutral, in which case I would probably just leave it out if it's optional. So it's important to sort of, as I said, navigate these sort of perceptions of the student's background, their candidacy, any advantages that they may have. And when it comes to parents' occupations and backgrounds, again, there's two different factors. One is the student's level of privilege. The second one is whether the student has some sort of unfair advantage because their parents' areas of professional expertise or status are very closely aligned with the students' areas that they will be signaling in the application, what their interests are and their career interests. And another point related to that is admissions officers, if they see that the student's interest in terms of their activities and what they're positioning for and what they're aiming to study in terms of their majors, if they see that that's very similar to the parent's background, it can also raise some suspicion as to how genuine those interests are and really reflect the student's authentic interests and passions versus how much they might be more parentally imposed or influenced. And as much as possible, you do want the students, their intended majors, their resume, their academic interests, their career interests, you do want them to come across as being genuine passions and interests of the student, not areas that are potentially being influenced by a parent. And so that is another, again, sort of subtle perceptual factor that you want to navigate in the application as much as you possibly can. Now, if you were to put something like the other section, or to put, and to put very specific companies or hospital or anything very specific that can be tied to the student's activities, for example. So if the student had an internship and it was very closely related to something that was in the parent's background or occupation, again, that can raise a red flag. There are many students who do internships, quote unquote internships, at, a parent's firm or their business, or it comes through some sort of networking connection. And so you just have to be careful about some of those optics. It's not going to be very root-worthy or likable if a student has an unfair advantage or their activity is connected to one of their parents' backgrounds or strengths or professional areas. So I would just be very careful in navigating this parent occupation field, given that, again, it is optional. And in terms of if a student does have parents, for example, who are MDs, you're not going to be able to hide that. However, what you can do is if you can't sort of, get rid of parents' backgrounds in terms of if the student has two MD parents and they have maybe biomedical leaning interests and activities, same thing goes for, we see many, many students, particularly Indian American, Asian American students who are very overrepresented in STEM and technology fields for which they're applying, and both of their parents have STEM or technology backgrounds. And again, it's not the best picture to sort of paint in terms of the parents very strongly potentially influencing what the child's interests or passions are. The admissions officer, again, are going to view that a little bit skeptically in some cases, or at the very least, they're just going to view it as that student certainly has an advantage, versus a student who maybe doesn't have the benefit of having parents who have those sorts of backgrounds that are relevant to the student's interests. But if you can't avoid sort of signaling this in some way because of the parent degrees, they have MBAs, they have MDs, etc., you should then be looking to potentially monitor in terms of how the student positions. So we've discussed this a lot on the podcast. There are very common pre-professional areas that many students apply for, such as engineering, wanting to be a doctor or be pre-med, The pre-med one is particularly non-advantageous and not necessary at all, given that students are not applying to medical school at an undergraduate level. There are other ways that this can sort of be negotiated, and we'll discuss this a little bit in the future plan section coming up, but a student doesn't have to, if they have two MD parents, they do not have to brand, even if they have some biomedical or health leaning activities. They don't need to say per se that they want to also be an MD. There are many biomedical or health related careers. And so there are many different ways of sort of packaging or spinning a student's interest. And as I have mentioned on this podcast, it does not behoove a student to simply lump themselves in with all of the other students who want to, just say that they want to be doctors. So there's a lot of sort of strategic flexibility and considerations as to how students sort of package or pull together those interests and their background. And there are many more interesting, unique, niche ways. For instance, a student could take interest in public health or health communication, science communication. There's many other offshoots. For example, if a student had a health activity, but they also were part of the student newspaper, they could pull together an intersection theme there, sort of communicating science or advocating, health advocacy, sort of a public policy or health policy angle. There's a lot of interesting, unique, sort of connections or ways of positioning that student can pull together to avoid some of these, sort of traps, which a worst case scenario would be a student who just straight up positions says they just want to be a doctor, like the 10,000 other students in the applicant pool are saying the exact same thing, and then they have two parents who have MD backgrounds, and it's not that it's going to get a student rejected in and of itself. However, it is not ideal from a strategic perspective and from a branding and a perception perspective. Just something to keep in mind. Number 2, under the future plan section, which I just mentioned. So a lot of this is going to be, again, a lot of this is student branding. It is ideally trying to make the student as likable as possible, as worthy as possible, not conveying if the student had any advantages, not trying to keep, making those very obvious or very clear if they don't need to be emphasized any further. And in the future plan section, I think on top of that, we're also trying to add a bit of uniqueness to the student's candidacy, as I just sort of mentioned with the positioning, and not the student just saying, if they have some biomedical or some health-related interest, just projecting it in the most common, expected, typical direction, which is to be a doctor. So when you get to the future plan section, and this sort of is the student's career interest, a student could, put something, for example, like they want to be a science researcher instead of an MD. Science researcher is not going to be the rarest occupation in the world. There's farmer or rancher under the career interest there, or the future plans, which certainly is likely to be more rare. However, it's probably going to be comparatively more rare than a student saying that they want to be an MD. So if a student's interest and their background is strategically malleable toward different possible career paths, try to sort of survey what are students in the overall applicant pool going to be saying more, what tends to be very popular and trendy versus what's maybe a little bit more unique or differentiating or interesting, and try to go with the latter. Again, this is an exercise in trying to differentiate the students, not trying to get them to blend in with everybody else. And then there is actually a little bit of a hack here to the future plan section. So if you actually put other, so if you select other, there are different sort of default categories that are listed, just as I mentioned, the parent occupation section. However, if you click other, you can then actually give a more specific description. And this is actually quite nice because the student can actually put something that is even more differentiating or even more unique and sort of create a very unique potential tagline. And I have discussed, for example, in the Building an Admissions Hook episode, the student's positioning and their admission story you want to be as unique as it can possibly be. That really comes from it being more niche or maybe intersecting multiple fields. And so I've mentioned something like behavioral economics or social entrepreneurship is going to be a lot more unique than just a student interested in business, because those are very specific subdomains or interdisciplinary fields. And so the student can really actually use this to their benefit if they want to put something like other, and then they can actually even go well beyond just what the sort of fixed categories are here, or they'll have more leeway to potentially differentiate with a sort of tagline. And so a student, for example, could put something like, if they click other, they'll have about a line. They don't have a ton of words, but they'll have some words. And they could put something like, I want to leverage my public policy background alongside my quantitative experience to launch, a Washington, D.C. think tank. They could put something like, I want to harness my entrepreneurial spirit to kickstart an infrastructure of giving that puts critical products in the hands of those who need it. And so the first student would be one who sort of has a quantitative and a policy background, and is sort of showing a very specific outlet or sort of an entrepreneurial sort of spirit, in a policy, from sort of a policy angle, to launch a think tank and leverage their quantitative background as well. And the second student is leveraging their, this would sort of be more of a social entrepreneurial angle. But you can notice that these phrases help the student to really stand out a lot more versus just putting something like business exec, or even putting something in other, like, I want to work on an investment banking at Wall Street. It's very common areas that students are generally targeting, and that will not really differentiate their applications. Okay, number 3, Social Security number. So there is a subfield under the geography nationality section where students can put their Social Security number. If you look at the instructions very carefully, it says that you should put a Social Security number if you are applying for financial aid. However, many students are very accustomed, again, they're just going through the whole common application. They're not seeing which fields are necessarily required versus those that aren't required, because it's only a little tiny red asterisk that differentiates those two types of fields. And then they're not always reading the fine print. Many students will accidentally put in a Social Security number. And, the listener might sort of question, well, why does that matter if the student puts in a Social Security number? Well, if you put in a Social Security number, as I just mentioned, it can be a flag to admissions that the student is potentially applying for financial aid. If a student is applying for financial aid, many of these colleges, particularly the top colleges, have historically claimed to be need blind, or some of them, for example, Washington University more recently, have unveiled, quote unquote, need blind policies. And what that means is the institution is not factoring in the student's amount of financial need, or their financial aid package. It's not affecting whether the student's actually admitted to the institution or not. However, like many things in admissions, what colleges have said versus what they've actually done in practice have turned out to be two entirely different things. And there have been investigations and subsequent lawsuits against many of these top colleges who have basically colluded and conspired to limit the amount of financial aid that they need to actually give and the financial packages. And all of that has basically shown that these institutions are not as blind to need as they might claim that they are. And so it's very important that students and parents operate under the mindset that unless you really know that you will need financial aid at the institution, and you can assess this by going on the financial aid page, and there are typically calculators that will give you a very good sense of this. Unless you know you definitely need financial aid, You should not be putting in a social security number into the application and potentially having that flagged for financial aid and negatively affecting the student's candidacy. You should not be filling out a FAFSA in the fall. And some parents, unfortunately, make this mistake, and it can potentially jeopardize a student's candidacy. And at the very least, it is always better to be safe than to be sorry. So unless you are absolutely certain that you will need financial aid for a student to attend college, you should not be putting in a social security number into this field. Number 4, activities list. So the activities list is essentially where the student's resume goes. It's a more sort of concise version of a resume. So there's a position field, a title field. There's a very short description of what the student's contributions are in that activity. And in terms of some subtle red flags here, one would be very exaggerated weekly commitments or number of hours. We had a student way back who actually put something like 90 hours or something a week for a given activity. And it did actually check out. It was a summer activity and it was some sort of service activity that actually did have an extreme hourly commitment. However, that can potentially raise a very significant red flag to an admissions officer. Also, if you put something like 52 weeks a year, school clubs do not meet 52 weeks a year because school is not in session every single week of the year, certainly not over the summer and not over many holidays. Typically, students, if it's a school club, they'll put something like 35 weeks, 30 weeks, something along those lines. It's fine. Doesn't have to be exact or perfect. But it can't be way off. You also have to make sure that the hours, beyond just the hours looking very extreme for an activity. So if it's a school club, a student spending 20 hours a week on a school club is extremely implausible. Even spending 10 or more hours on a school club is extremely unlikely, unless the student is just making massive contributions and they founded the club and they're doing, all sorts of work to have got, getting the club started, etc. Just very unlikely. There are just improbable hour counts for many activities. But even beyond just an activity level, it is also looking at the aggregation of all of the hours across all of the students' activities. So there are a maximum of 10 activities in the activities list. And so you also sort of want to gut check, so to speak, the overall number of hours. If it looks like the student basically for, 3 years or multiple years or in a given year in 11th grade is, their activities add up to 50 hours a week, it's extremely implausible. So I would also do some due diligence here and make sure you're checking the activities on an activity, just a per activity basis, but then also what do they add up to, and making sure nothing would come across as being very suspicious. You can also have things like very unusual, implausible figures, such as the student having fundraised an exceptional amount of money for one of the activities, accomplishments, exceptional accomplishments, and you have to be careful with some of this stuff. So one of the former deans of admission at the University of Pennsylvania, Penn, Eric Furta, was once asked what they would do at Penn if a student's application raised red flags. And very uncharacteristic of many admissions officers. Eric Furta is actually, I kind of call him one of the few truth tellers in admissions. Unfortunately, he no longer is at Penn. He's now at Penn Charter, which is a high school in Philadelphia. He's one of the rare truth tellers in admissions. And a lot of admissions officers would have said something and they would have sugarcoated it of, we'll really look into it and we'll do our due diligence, etc. And he just said, we just don't have the time. There's way too many applications. And if significant red flags are raised on a student's application, it goes in the garbage bin. And that can seem very harsh to a student or to a family. But unfortunately, they are going through these very quickly. And admissions is not a process whereby there's all sorts of corroboration and validation of information, and it's logistically unfeasible, particularly with the number of applications that are now submitted to these colleges, with things like the Common Application, test optional policies, the rise of international students submitting more and more and more applications as things get, increasingly competitive. So it is important that you make sure there's nothing extremely suspicious. Now, if a student is very highly accomplished, and we have many students who have exceptional resumes and accomplishments and superlatives and fundraising figures and all sorts of numbers and figures that really can jump off the page. What is important is to hedge that a little bit, or to corroborate it in the application itself. For example, having the counselor in the counselor letter of recommendation, having the counselor attest to that as well. So often our students are putting a lot of their, the accomplishments are also going in things like their junior questionnaire for their counselor letter. They can cross-corroborate it with information in the teacher recommendations. And those more objective sources of information, this can also include things like a research professor the student has worked with writing a supplementary recommendation. We've had a student who worked at NASA and got a NASA recommender. And you can even, it doesn't have to be, somebody who has, exceptional title per se. It could be a hospital supervisor who thinks the world of a student. But really, it has to come across as though if the student has exceptional accomplishments, that it's very plausible. And so if the teacher recommendations and the counselor recommendation doesn't speak to any particular superlatives or any of these accomplishments, or they don't seem to be very exceptional letters, or to describe the student in extremely glowing terms, that's going to be very suspicious. You would expect a student who has, quite extraordinary accomplishments and figures and, is balancing an exceptional number of activities and hours and commitments. You would expect that student's letters of recommendation to be absolutely glowing, for that student to earn very high marks in terms of some of the ratings that go in the cover letters of some of these recommendation forms, where the teacher can basically say, is this sort of an average student that you've taught? Is this one of the few, one of the best students that you've ever taught, etc. So that's why there is a synergy in the application. It's why we work with our students on, all the different components of the application. So their teacher recommendation letters are excellent. Their counselor recommendation is excellent. We make sure that it has information that is going to sort of cross-corroborate with the activities list. And so it is also a matter of not even being suspicious in a vacuum, but being suspicious relative to some of the other components in the application. Particularly what other more objective people, such as the counselor, the teachers, not just the student themselves, what they are saying about the students. And if a student is claiming to have, launched or to have run a successful business, or, an app is very big nowadays, and certainly in recent years, with, the development of coding resources, many students claim to have launched an app. You really want to have an established online presence or internet presence for that business or that app. Assume that admissions officer, they're not necessarily going to be doing this. It depends by the college and by the admissions officer, but you should be assuming that they will be looking up anything that sounds like it's exceptional, or if a student runs a business or if they launch an application, assume that they're going to be looking for some sort of validation of this information. And so you should have an established website. You should have an established internet presence. If I go and I look up your app, or I go and look up your business in Google and nothing appears, or I go and look up your website and it's just one landing page with a few lines and it looks like this is, fake, or, manipulated in some ways, that is, again, going to raise very significant red flags in the process, and do not be surprised if you get rejected, purely from those red flags being raised, essentially. In terms of Internships or activities, again, you want to make sure that none of this ideally can be easily connected to a parent or an unfair sort of connection or family connection. So this is where there's a bit of, a nexus between the parent occupation, what fields are they in, from our earlier conversation. Hopefully you didn't go and list in the other section that your parent works at this very specific company, and then you put that company name on the activity and show that you got a quote-unquote internship at that. So just be very careful when it comes to balancing the perception of any activities or internships that could easily be connected to a student's, to the parents, to their backgrounds, and can look like an unfair advantage. And then finally, number 5, for some of the writing components. So most of the prior components are more smaller fields, and they can look more just like pretty straightforward data entry fields. The activities list, social security number, the future plans, etc. When it comes to more of the full-blown writing components, the essays, even the additional information section in the Common Application, which is 650 words, so it's as long as the Common App personal essay, the school-specific supplements, and, which are the school-specific essays. Why do you want to go to this college? Why do you want to study this major, this field? When it comes to the writing components, wherever there is full-blown writing, and it could even be shorter form writing in some of these fields, such as the activities list, there are a couple of very subtle red flags, and I think a lot of these red flags are quite subtle. I don't know that a lot of people would be thinking about the social security number or be thinking about the parent occupation field. So a lot of these things are subtle. One very subtle giveaway that a student had help or there was influence over their application by a parent or some other party is if they see 2 spaces after periods. And for parents, you will typically know why this might be a giveaway. So this sort of dates back to the days of typewriters. Having these 2 spaces after periods is not something that occurs anymore. No student, who's of, current high school age puts 2 spaces after periods. And so that can be a dead giveaway that a parent, somebody who is older, is basically editing or writing the application, or is influencing in some way the application. You definitely do not want to be signaling that. Second, if there are any just extremely unlikely words that a student is just very unlikely, a 16, 17-year-old is very unlikely to be using in the application, that can be a red flag. Now, students who are applying to the top and highly selective schools that we focus this podcast around are generally very strong writers, and they do write very well, and they do have elevated vocabularies, as you would expect for students who are applying to some of the most selective institutions in the United States. However, it is still something to monitor. There are degrees of vocabulary, and there are levels in terms of extremely esoteric words versus, a student might know this word's pretty fancy, but it's nothing, absolutely crazy. So just be mindful of that, particularly if you're a parent and you're editing a student's essays. Second, any real or related to that, I guess this would be third here, any very legalese or just an odd writing style. If it sounds like a 50-year-old philosopher is writing some of these essays or some of these bullet points, that also can come across as being exceptionally odd. And it does seem like there are a lot of parents who are lawyers, and because of their law background and just, their significant writing experience, and always writing agreements and contracts and et cetera, and reviewing materials, they are very involved in their students' applications, and they, I think, probably have an excessive amount of confidence in their ability to, help the student in the application because of the writing component. But unfortunately, a lot of this isn't just writing. It is very strategic, and it is knowing what the perception is going to be of certain, certain fields, certain information that's included. How rare is this student's content or this field versus another student's, content or their interest. And so a lot of it is much more strategic beyond sort of just coming from a professional area that is very writing intensive, such as being a lawyer. However, if you are a parent who is a lawyer, or your student, you have a parent who's a lawyer or comes from, a particular background, and the writing is just seems like it's almost very like contractual writing or an agreement, it's just going to be, it's going to come across as very odd to an admissions officer, and it's definitely going to raise a red flag. And especially if it's, you see sort of inconsistent editing and the tone is changing, or if the tone is just consistently just very, very odd tone for a 16 or 16, 17, 18-year-old student who's applying to undergraduate institutions. So that is another factor to consider as well. That could be a red flag to admissions officers. And that is it in terms of these 5 red flags. So just to quickly reiterate them, and just to reiterate in general, you want to have a very strategic mindset when it comes to filling out absolutely everything in every last field in the applications. As I said, anything you say can and will be used against you in the court of admissions. Do not assume anything that you put in the application is not going to be evaluated or potentially be met with skepticism or cynicism or viewed in a certain way. Nearly everything is subject to that. So number 1, we talked about parent occupation, just being very careful. It is an optional field. Just being very careful about doubling down or making it even more clear to admissions officers if you come from more elevated social standing or more privileged background. Certainly, if that's the case, not putting the other field and then going even more into further description and doubling down on that. You have to be very careful in terms of that being perceived as connected to the student's interest, and maybe their interest not being as genuine, or there maybe being some special advantage that is afforded to the student, even in terms of their activities or internships that could be connected back to their parents and their backgrounds. Second, future plans. If you can put something that's a little bit more rare or unlikely for students to put, for example, researcher versus MD, or some other health-related angle versus just another student who's putting physician in that field, or whatever it's going to be for whatever the student's interests are. If there is a more unique way or offshoot or way of sort of conveying the student's interest, that is going to be more ideal. Unfortunately, and fortunately for some students just naturally have very unique interests, and a whole bunch of students just don't have very unique interest. It just is what it is. Some students just really have the benefit of their natural organic interests are extremely rare and exceptionally unique. So a student who wants to study English in college is just going to have a bit more of a benefit and going to be more rare than a student who wants to study business. And that just is unfortunately the way that it is. And if you are a student who has very common interest, or you have a student who has very common interest, you do have to the extent that you want to, and you want to, sort of strategically create the best application that you can and be aware of the competition and the field, and having this application stand out, you do have to be aware of many of these factors. And there are, the students also don't 100% know what they want to do in their career. So in many ways it is flexible. A lot of students are putting MD and they might think that they want to be an MD, but many of those students are not going to be an MD anyway. So there is a lot of flexibility, just in many students don't know what they actually want to be. Go with something that can potentially be a little bit more unique or differentiating. As I said, it does have to still piggyback on what the students' experiences, what their activities are. You can't totally just make something up that's, I want to run a nonprofit and there's no interest, or there's no interest that's been evidenced in the student's background for that, and just kind of comes across as being totally illegitimate. You cannot do that. But if the student has a certain background, and there's different ways, as I said, you could spit it into many different health-related, biomedically related careers. You could intersect it with other fields. you have a lot of strategic latitude in terms of packaging the same evidence. And as I mentioned, there is another field where you can give a longer description that would be more unique in terms of what the student's career interests would be. Social security number, do not put it unless you know for sure you are applying for financial aid. Activities list, just be very careful in terms of exaggerating any weekly commitments, number of hours, very unusual or exaggerated figures, fundraising accomplishments, having a business, having a phone application if you have no internet presence or you're not talking about it, in very specific ways and detailing that in the application, or a counselor or teacher isn't sort of corroborating that information. You just need to be very careful. And if you do have some exceptional accomplishments, you might want to make sure that those accomplishments are sort of backstopped or corroborated, and they make their way into some of your recommenders letters as well. So there's some objective validity there, on top of also having a legitimate internet presence, website, etc., where there's some official documentation. And then in terms of any internships or any activities, again, related to parent backgrounds, unfair advantages, just be very careful with the optics there. And then finally, number 5, in terms of red flags, was just writing 2 spaces after periods. Try to make sure that never comes across in the application. It would be a dead giveaway that an adult or somebody who's much older was editing the application or writing the application, and just try to avoid any exceptionally esoteric words, ideally, or vocabulary that's extremely unlikely to come from a 17 or 18-year-old, and any very odd, tone or legalese or a very odd writing style. That seems like it would be from a 55-year-old adult and not from a 17-year-old. That is it for today's episode. Hopefully that was helpful to everyone, and we will talk soon in the next episode. Thank you. Bye-bye.